on the winning side, you had Puka Nacua, and Nacua was unbelievable. This was his best game as a pro, fantasy-wise, period. This is a player who we've seen have multiple 30-point weeks, a guy who continually has put up these really, really strong numbers. This season, you've seen him put up a bunch of really high 20-point totals. He's been just terrific since he returned from the injured reserve. But we finally saw just a true smash week. He got a running touchdown. So this was something we don't often see from Puka Nacua. They used him on a sweep, and he scored a touchdown. And they gave him a higher number of rushing attempts, just trying to get the ball in his hands at 5 carries this game. Ends up with 12 receptions on 14 targets, 162 receiving yards, and a touchdown. This was crazy. It was 17 touches for Puka Nacua. Again, 41.8 PPR points. This is the most he's ever had during his 2-year career. And it's really the dominance he's had on the offense. He had a 46% target share. Cooper Kupp scored a touchdown, but this was a Puka Nacua show. 46% target share. Simply ridiculous.
What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Week 14 fantasy football reactions, giving you the top 12 reactions, top 12 takeaways, getting you everything you need to know to get you ready for week 15. And week 15 is the fantasy football playoffs. Week 14 was supposed to be a quiet one. This was supposed to be one where if you got a decent score, you were going to win the week because there were 6 fewer teams playing. 6 teams on bye weeks usually means some lower scoring games. But it was anything but. This was a wild week. This was a lot of fun. And I should say it was a lot of fun unless you were going up against Josh Allen. We're going to talk about him in a little bit, but we got to talk about that Thursday night game. This was a tremendous game. We're talking about Lions-Packers, a game that we were really excited for a couple weeks leading up to this one. This was like a playoff-type game where we knew this was going to be a competitive one, and it was. We had Detroit winning the game 34-31. But really for fantasy football, the story of the game continues to be the impressive play from Josh Jacobs. And Jacobs in this one, this was old school. This wasn't him catching passes. This wasn't him having some remarkably high yardage total or doing anything really overly over the top, like out of the blue. This is more like old school ground and pound football, and the Lions cannot stop Josh Jacobs near the line of scrimmage. And this is a player who ended up with 18 carries for 66 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Josh Jacobs has really been one of the free agent signings of the year. And it's been easy to kind of get lost in the shuffle with Jacobs because of the impacts of Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. But when it comes down to it, Jacobs has been absolutely tremendous. And with Jacobs, it's really changed this offense. So Jacobs has had 6 out of his last 7 games with 20 or more PPR points. And this was 18 carries, which he's had every single week since their bye week. He's had at least 18 carries. So he's getting the rock. But this has affected Jordan Love and sort of the way that the Green Bay Packers are playing football, offensive football. And Jordan Love was a player where we think back to the Brazil game early in the year against Philly, and we think back to when Jordan Love came back and he was throwing all these touchdown passes. Jordan Love has not had a top 10 QB finish since week 7. This is a tough stretch for Jordan Love managers. And there is going to be certain situations where you might consider using a different quarterback in the fantasy football playoffs. So Josh Jacobs smashing, Jordan Love, another game where we wanted a little bit more fantasy-wise. And in that very same game, let's talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. Big-time Jahmyr Gibbs bounce-back game. Disappointment in the Thanksgiving game, and then a very strong performance on Thursday. And any notion that he would have been in the doghouse for any way because of the fumble on Thanksgiving, coupled with sort of the social media thing where he leaked something on the Lions board. This is one where that was just it was all noise because Jahmyr Gibbs is a stud. Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson get the most out of their offensive personnel. Jahmyr Gibbs gives you 19.3 points in this one. Really, really strong performance. And he had 21 touches. So this wasn't just a big play here or there, and Gibbs really manufactured those points. I mean, he earned it in this one. And he scored his 12th touchdown this season, which is more than any player in the 2023 class. And the 2023 class has just been very, very strong for fantasy this year. You think about Devon Achane. You think about Bijan Robinson. You think about Puka Nacua. You think about these players who have made big-time impacts. Jahmyr Gibbs leads all of them in touchdowns at the skill position. Absolutely a stud. And we'll stay in the NFC North. NFC North, this is a really strong division. Detroit, Green Bay, and of course, the Minnesota Vikings. And we had the Kirk Cousins revenge game. The Kirk Cousins goes on the road. Cousins has been struggling, and it was a chance for Cousins to go and beat his old team. And it wasn't going to happen today because the Minnesota passing game is absolutely on fire. Sam Darnold had a career-high 5 touchdown passes and went to his main man, Justin Jefferson. Tremendous to see Justin Jefferson get a 2-touchdown game. This has been a season where Jefferson's been really good, but not as many smash games as you would have anticipated. So with Jefferson gets you a terrific score. He gets you 32 points this week. And Jefferson, again, like we're talking about a guy who's wide receiver 2 overall, but this was his first performance where he scored more than 25 PPR points. And that's a high bar to cross. But for a guy like Jefferson, you would have expected to see more smash week performances. So he gets you his 132 receiving yards, gets you 7 catches, gets you the 2 touchdowns. And he wasn't even the best wide receiver on his team today. And that goes to Jordan Addison. And Jordan Addison is heating up. Jordan Addison had 3 touchdown catches. Addison has 6 touchdown catches over his last 6 games played. He's starting to really heat up heading into the fantasy football playoffs and the NFL playoffs. Addison has 17 touchdown catches in his career. If he can get to 10 this year during the NFL regular season, he'll be the 4th Minnesota Viking to have 2 double-digit touchdown seasons. And you're talking about some absolute legends. You're talking about Chris Carter. You're talking about Randy Moss. And you're talking about Adam Thielen, who was very strong for Minnesota for multiple seasons. And Jordan Addison's only 22 years old. So touchdowns are the main driver for fantasy football scoring. And Jordan Addison, for back-to-back seasons, has had a way of finding the end zone. And he's heating up at the right time. First half of the year, dealt with some injuries, dealt with some lower performances we'd like to see. But now Addison is absolutely balling. You're starting him every week in the fantasy football playoffs. And we have a lot of faith in this Minnesota passing game. Zach Charbonnet. Every single time Ken Walker has been out or not been knocked out of a game, Charbonnet had absolutely smashed heading into this week. So we had a 2-game sample size in weeks 2 and week 3 where Charbonnet averaged about 21 points per game and had tremendous usage in those 2 weeks. It's been Ken Walker for most of the season, and Ken Walker is a stud. But with Charbonnet, you've had one of the best backup running backs and really a 2-way threat, a guy who's a bigger, stronger back who can handle volume as a runner and also handle a great deal of work in the receiving game. And we really saw it again today, and it was unbelievable. Charbonnet was an absolute monster. 38 PPR points, ends up with 22 carries for 134 yards and 2 rushing scores. And he has 7 catches for 59 yards as a receiver out of the backfield. This was the most catches of any running back this week heading into Sunday Night Football. And now in 3 games played where Zach Charbonnet has played more than 80% of snaps, he's averaged 27.3 points per game in those 3 weeks. So if you have Ken Walker on your fantasy team, I'm sure you really want Ken Walker back next week for the opening week of the fantasy football playoffs. But if you have Zach Charbonnet, you're okay with Walker sitting out because you'll have another RB1 week if Walker is out again next week. So keep an eye on Walker throughout the fantasy football playoffs. And let's talk about Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith scores the game-winning touchdown in overtime against the New York Jets. And this was a quiet game for Jonnu heading into it. But in overtime, he had 3 catches and, of course, catches the winner. And this is a 13.4 point performance from Jonnu. And what's crazy is this was his lowest scoring game over his last 4 games played. This has been an unbelievable year for him. Again, a free agent signing, just like with the running backs, we've seen other positions hit as well. And Jonnu is looking like a player that's going to be making a big impact in the fantasy football playoffs. He leads Miami with 58 receptions. And when you think about him having more receptions than Tyreek Hill, and he has 6 fewer targets than Tyreek Hill, and when you talk about him having more receptions than Devon Achane, slightly more, this is a player who's really, really had a great deal of success. Certainly over the second half of the season, Jonnu Smith is locked in. And another player who we talked about earlier in the year, anybody who watches School of Scott with Scott Barrett and myself, or reads Scott's Everything Report, Jauan Jennings has been a player that has been really a fantasy points kind of flag plant, a guy that was looked at as a player who could be maybe the waiver wire signing of the season. Jennings, of course, saw a great deal of value spike when Brandon Ayuk went down with a season-ending injury. And we're seeing it again now where Jennings looks like a player who's set to really make an impact on the fantasy football playoffs. So you had Brock Purdy returning this week, and everything worked great for San Francisco. They absolutely needed a win. This was a must-win situation for them against Chicago at home. And Jennings ends up with 7 catches for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. Plays absolutely fantastic, gets 8 targets, 28 PPR points. And this is his 3rd game with 25 or more PPR points. And since San Francisco's bye week, he's had 16 or more PPR points in 3 out of 5 weeks. But really what's become apparent is Deebo Samuel, whether it's him getting older, whether it's him being really banged up, or most likely a combination of the two, Jennings is really the one where you want in your fantasy football lineup heading into the fantasy football playoffs, playing at it's not even close, the kind of levels of play between the two right now in terms of fantasy production. Jennings just looks like the one that Brock Purdy wants to target. And this game for Jennings happened in the same game that George Kittle gave you a smash week. So Jennings was able to thrive alongside a George Kittle week. And George Kittle gives you 151 receiving yards, but he's not even, you already had George Kittle in your starting lineup. So really the takeaway for me is Jauan Jennings absolutely is going to be a wide receiver 2 with spike week potential in the fantasy football playoffs. And next week they get the LA Rams, and the LA Rams and the Buffalo Bills played arguably the best game of the season for fantasy football collectively. This was a game that was unbelievable. You had a 44-42 game, and this was, of course, in the 4 o'clock slate. So if you're watching Red Zone, this was like 12 touchdowns were scored in this one. This was everything it was cracked out to be. The LA Rams get a huge, huge win. But what was great for us as fantasy managers is Josh Allen, we finally got to see him this year in a game flow situation where he had to put his foot on the gas. There's been so many games this year where Buffalo's been in complete control of the game, and it's been a little bit more of Josh Allen managing the game. There's been more James Cook this season. Josh Allen has not been quite as effective as he was in the previous 2 seasons. He's really taken sort of a back seat this year to guys like Lamar Jackson in terms of impacting the game of fantasy football. But Josh Allen is still just that guy. When it comes down to it, there are few players that have ever played fantasy at the quarterback position, or excuse me, few players that have ever played in the NFL that we put in our fantasy lineups at the quarterback position that can impact a fantasy football scoring line as well as Josh Allen. And this was a vintage game for him. 6 touchdowns. 3 of which came on the ground, which is something where, again, it's almost by design that they've been trying to limit Josh Allen from just being reckless with his body. But when push comes to shove, as the season's moved along, Allen's not going to get the 15 rushing touchdowns that he did last season, but he's certainly heating up. With these 3 touchdown scores today, you're talking about a player who now has 6 rushing touchdowns over his last 4 games played. But this is the one where Allen's also doing it as a passer. He passes for 342 yards. This was only his second 300-yard passing performance of the season. He had that one back in week 7 against Tennessee, but he passes for 3 touchdowns. Just unbelievable by Josh Allen. And I don't know if we're going to get this every single week, but we might get it next week because Josh Allen, in opening week of the fantasy football playoffs, goes into Detroit, and you're going to have Buffalo coming off of a loss, going into Detroit, arguably the best team in the AFC, going up against the best team in the NFC, in a game where there could absolutely be fantasy football fireworks. This is a game, if you're a DFS player, you're going to be chasing it. And if you are playing in fantasy next week in your playoffs and you are trying to make a start-sit decision, break ties with the Detroit-Buffalo game because this is a game where there's going to be a lot of scoring. And Allen was obviously not the only fantasy star in this one. On the winning side, you had Puka Nacua, and Nacua was unbelievable. This was his best game as a pro, fantasy-wise, period. This is a player who we've seen have multiple 30-point weeks, a guy who continually has put up these really, really strong numbers. This season, you've seen him put up a bunch of really high 20-point totals. He's been just terrific since he returned from the injured reserve. But we finally saw just a true smash week. He got a running touchdown. So this was something we don't often see from Puka Nacua. They used him on a sweep, and he scored a touchdown. And they gave him a higher number of rushing attempts, just trying to get the ball in his hands. Had 5 carries this game. Ends up with 12 receptions on 14 targets, 162 receiving yards, and a touchdown. This was crazy. It was 17 touches for Puka Nacua. Again, 41.8 PPR points. This is the most he's ever had during his 2-year career. And it's really the dominance he's had on the offense. He had a 46% target share. Cooper Kupp scored a touchdown, but this was a Puka Nacua show. 46% target share, simply ridiculous. Tremendous performance. And we talked about San Francisco a little bit earlier. Next week, you're going to get a massive game in in San Francisco, where the Rams go on the road and both teams are in sort of must-win territory. This is another game that could be extremely exciting for us in fantasy, LA versus San Francisco. And one negative is San Francisco today. We talked about Kittle, we talked about Jennings, we talked about Purdy returning, but there's going to be sort of a dark cloud over the game for San Francisco. They already lost Christian McCaffrey. They already lost Jordan Mason. And then today, Isaac Guerendo, if you picked him up on the waiver wire or if you'd stashed him all season long, you were feeling fantastic because he played really, really well. He had 2 touchdowns. He had 128 combined yards. And this is a player where you're sort of watching it and you're like, oh my God, it's happening. I've got a guy who's going to end up being a guy who could be a potential league winner. 26.8 PPR points for the rookie running back, with both of the guys ahead of him out for probably the season when it comes down to it. And now Isaac Guerendo exits the game, then comes back, then heads to the locker room. So he goes in the medical tent, the whole idea, then he comes out of it. Maybe he's going back in the game, and then he just goes back to the locker room. So about as tilting as it gets for Isaac Guerendo managers, you might be adding Patrick Taylor on the waiver wire this week and going back to it if you're in the fantasy football playoffs. So really, really tough one for Guerendo managers. Let's hope this is nothing. It's a foot injury. I don't know the extent of it. Make sure you're tuning in to Fantasy Points this week to find out more about this injury. And speaking of injuries, really, really tough one. Jonathon Brooks carted off the field. This is a player who obviously had a significant injury at Texas, missed most of this season, 2nd-round pick, a player where if you're a dynasty manager, This was a lock first rounder last year in your dynasty rookie draft. And if you're in redraft or best ball manager, this is a guy who you drafted him thinking he could make an impact right now towards the end of the season. Certainly Chuba Hubbard has been fantastic this season. But this was still Jonathon Brooks, a player that very excited about the talent level. And then to see him get carted off the field, and it was a non-contact knee injury. This could be, I don't want to speculate on this one. We'll find out more this week, but this looks like one that could be a big issue for him, certainly for the rest of the season and maybe moving forward. And it really shines more of a light on Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard, again, 20.7 PPR points today. Carolina was very competitive with Philadelphia. Bryce Young making some tremendous plays. But Chuba Hubbard had 30 touches today. And this is going to be what's going to happen the rest of the season. Jonathon Brooks will be out, and Chuba Hubbard will get bell cow usage. That's sort of your plan. So if you have Chuba Hubbard on your team, he's a lock in your lineup, and you're excited about it every single week, probably in your RB2 spot based on his ADP. And then rookie wide receiver scoring. So this is a time of year where we're looking for rookies to come in and kind of expand upon their play in the season. A lot of times we see these breakouts. You think about guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown during his rookie year, where they really, really take their game up to another level in the playoffs. And this year, certainly when it came down to it, we had a couple of big time rookies. But the two highest scoring rookie wide receivers were the ones not in our lineup and probably won't be in our lineup next week either. You ended up with Ladd McConkey, who was red hot last week, played fantastic. He's out against Kansas City. So you weren't able to use him this week. Marvin Harrison Jr., who of course had a big game last week, ends up with only 8.9 PPR points. Very, very disappointing game for him. Brian Thomas gets 16 points. So you start him, you're feeling pretty good. Malik Neighbors gets you 14.9. So maybe he ended up playing when he was potentially going to sit out. So, but he scored a little bit fewer points than you would have liked in a must-win Week 14 for a lot of you. But then you end up getting a 20-pointer out of Jalen McMillan, who was sort of a best ball, like meme stock type player, where we were actually pretty excited about him when Chris Godwin went down with an injury. McMillan, we've been sort of waiting on this, and now he's been long forgotten. And he ends up with 2 touchdown catches this week. It's 20-plus PPR points. And then Rome Odunze, who'd been playing sort of third fiddle to DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, ends up getting 20-plus points, gets some garbage time touchdowns. Just the tilting nature of fantasy football. And it does shine a light on this is a very strong rookie class of wide receivers. Hopefully next week we see more of the same from Brian Thomas. We see more from Malik Neighbors. And it's a great thing Malik Neighbors played. He had that hip scare. We thought he could be out for the season. And he's very much in the game, making plays right down in the fourth quarter. So good for him. And we need a lot more out of Marvin Harrison, but just a tilting week with rookie wide receiver scoring. And then finally, we'll close it out. This is one where I don't want to be talking about this. Trey McBride watch. And Trey McBride, anybody who's consumed my content here at Fantasy Points has seen, like, Trey McBride's a player that I think is a stud. And again, today, 14 targets, 7 catches for 70 yards. This is a player with big-time talent. If you drafted him, you're happy. He's second in targets among all tight ends behind Brock Bowers, and he's played a game fewer than Brock Bowers. Second in catches, second in receiving yards, and he's neck and neck for the lead among all tight ends in targets per game. But what he doesn't have is a single touchdown catch. And this is getting to be a little bit of a problem because you've got Diontae Johnson holding the record with 86 catches without a touchdown. That's your all-time record for the most catches without a touchdown catch. Trey McBride now has 80. So he could potentially have a record that no player wants to have. Let's hope that next week Arizona can find Trey McBride on an early touchdown and his name is not like in the record books with some sort of a catastrophe stat. Because this is a player, again, that we think is absolutely a stud. This is just bad luck, and sometimes bad luck happens. So positive touchdown regression Hopefully it goes on with Trey McBride in the fantasy playoffs. And next week, he's got the New England Patriots at home. This could be a great opportunity for him to get on the board. Let's hope it's in the first quarter, maybe on his first catch, breaks a long one. I'm Theo Gremminger. If you like videos like this, make sure you're subscribed and make sure you hit the like button and stick with us here at Fantasy Points. We're dropping content like this all week long that it can help you win your fantasy football playoffs.